And this is sort of apropos to that, because we're going to be talking about forgetting today. So let's step in our Wayback Machines and go back to last Monday. I guess was the last time that we met. What did we talk about last Monday?
Long-term memory.
Okay. Pretty safe bet. Encoding, retrieval, long-term memory. Anything more specific than that?
Schema, context.
Oh, yeah, we did talk about schemas and context. Not contacts, Adrian. Context.
Oh, sorry.
So, yeah, we're talking about things that help you to encode stuff. Is that right? So, some things do help you. What about effort to learn? Does effort to learn help you? No. Repetition? No. Thinking about meaning helps you. Your schemas do help you if it's congruent with the schema. If it's well, actually, hold on a second. At encoding, if it's incongruent, then it helps you. At retrieval, if it's congruent, then it helps you. Does that make sense? So, what does congruent with a schema mean? Yeah, what you expect. What's sort of within the norm, within the script, within the sort of pattern that you're expecting. Yeah. So today I wanted to talk about forgetting, and then next time, tomorrow, we'll talk about semantic memory. And schemas actually flow nicely into semantic memory and how we sort of organize things semantically. But I want to talk about sort of capacity and forgetting rates, sort of to recap so far what we've talked about in memory. So we talked about sensory memory to begin with. It has a relatively large capacity, but a very short duration. We forget it almost immediately, within a second or so. Short-term memory is sort of it's really a bad misnomer, the whole short-term, long-term thing. And I can't think of a better way to put it, really. Working memory sort of gets around that, but we always think of working memory as having a short duration. But that's not necessarily the defining characteristic. The defining characteristic is it's what you're dealing with sort of here and now. It's what you're currently thinking about. William James had a great way of putting it where he called this immediate memory or primary memory and this secondary memory. So that's how far the field has come in 100 and some odd years is we're back to William James and calling things exactly the same. Because it sort of makes a lot more sense than long-term and short-term. Particularly when you look at people who have no long-term memory. So people who have amnesia, people like patient HM, for example, they've got intact short-term memory, but they still have some impairments even in the short term. So they're still drawing on long-term memory for tasks that only take a couple of seconds, right? So, and it has to do with this capacity thing. The capacity of short-term memory is sort of our mantra is the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. So around 7 chunks of information you can hold in short-term memory. But what about for faces? Can you hang on to 7 faces at a time? What do you think? You probably don't have a lot of practice hanging on to 7 faces. Corey?
I know a really common thing with new faces is meeting a lot of new people in settings where you meet people quickly, like at my wedding and things like that.
Uh-huh.
I will remember that I have met someone.
Okay.
I can't remember anything about them.
Okay. Like their name, for example?
Right.
Yeah. So I was just at a conference. I went to dinner with a bunch of grad students that I didn't really know. They're all BYU students, but they're not in my lab, so I don't really know them very well. And yeah, so there were maybe 10 or so people at this table, and I can tell you maybe 1 or 2 of their names. I can recognize them all, but being able to sort of match up names with whose lab they're in and what research they're doing and who they are, yeah. Or weddings, when you do the reception at your church and then the reception or the open house at your wife's church, where you're in Sholo, Arizona, for example, and you've never met anybody from Sholo other than your in-laws, yeah, good luck. Now, how many umpteen years later, I'm starting to remember people and say, oh, yeah, they're your ward back home, aren't they? But, yeah, no, forget about it. So the whole point is that short-term and long-term may not be the best way to capture these things. A better way may be to talk in terms of capacity. And sometimes you're drawing on long-term memory or the same structures that are involved in long-term memory because it's got a larger capacity. So the capacity may be infinite. We don't know. Why don't we know what the capacity of long-term memory is? I think we talked about this. Did we talk about different kinds of tests? Free recall, cued recall, recognition. Is this ringing a bell? No? Yes? Okay. We're talking about sensitivity? Okay, all right. So the reason that we don't know the capacity has to do with the sensitivity of our tests. So let's say I give you a free recall test, and I say, tell me everything you know. Tell me everything you remember from last week. We'll narrow it down, from last Monday. Yeah. You can see the response that I get from that. So maybe if I say we talked about retrieval, we talked about tests, and I give you a cue, then it makes it a little bit easier, right? And then if I give you if I show the slides again, then you're going to say, oh yeah, I remember seeing that. The one with the helicopter. Do you remember the one with the helicopter? And then the two helicopters. And we talked about the cues and the similarity of the cues and things like that, and interference and stuff like that. Oh yeah, okay. Now this is all sort of starting to come back. And so if I gave you the exact same lecture again, you'd learn the material much faster, so you have savings in relearning. All right, so the stuff that at first it didn't seem like you remembered anything about last Monday. But now that I start talking about it again, oh yeah, it's all in there, right? So maybe I just need a more sensitive test. Maybe I just need better cues to get at the memories that you actually have that are in there. So who's to say that you don't remember absolutely everything and I just need a better test to get at it, right? So it could be that everything is in there and we just don't have sensitive enough tests to get at it. So, and you can't disprove that, right? It's the universal negative. You can't disprove the universal negative. So it could be in there, we just don't know. Our tests just aren't good enough. Who knows? But for all intents and purposes, you do forget stuff. And that's actually what we're going to talk about today, is what you can remember and what you can't, and how quickly you forget things. So this all goes back to the very first. Oh, I was going to put my genealogy up here. So at this conference I was at, somebody mentioned their intellectual genealogy and how it goes all the way back to Ebbinghaus and Wilhelm Wundt and William James, and how cool that is, right? So if you can go on something like neurotree.org and put in like your professors' names and see who their advisors are and see how far back they go. And it turns out that everybody goes back to William James because he's the founder of psychology, right, of modern psychology. And so it's like tracing your lineage all the way back to Adam. Everybody goes back to Adam and Eve, right? Everybody goes back to William James, so it's not really that big a deal. But it's still kind of cool to see that. My genealogy includes Ebbinghaus, which is pretty cool, because he did memory research. So Ebbinghaus was an introspectionist, served as his own subject. But he wasn't doing the sort of stuff that the other introspectionists were doing. He actually followed some rigorous paradigms. So what he did is he had somebody come up with lists of nonsense syllables. So little words, monosyllabic words, one-syllable words like bap, yat, tig, nav, just these random little things. And then he would study them up to a criterion, put the list away, and then not think about it for a while, and test himself at various intervals. And what he found is that if he tested himself immediately, how do you think his memory was? Immediate test, no delay. I just gave you the list, bap, tib, yug, whatever it is. Pretty good, yeah. So he could remember a lot of this information. And then if he tested himself 2 hours later, 4 hours later, a day later, 2 days later, 4 days later, etc., his memory, it turns out, got worse pretty rapidly, but then sort of bottomed out. So immediate recall, he's near 100%. I don't know if you guys can see this in the back. I should blow it up. So immediate recall up here, he's at about 100%. 20 minutes later, he's down to 60%. An hour later, he's down to 50%, 9 hours. And then this is in days, 2 days, 4 days, 6 days, and then 31 days, a month out. So the difference between 6 days and a month out is pretty negligible. So this is about 1 week versus 4 weeks, and he's not forgetting a lot in this range. So the slope really slows down here. So this is what's come to be known as a forgetting curve, or an Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So the conclusion is you forget a lot at first, but then the forgetting rate sort of slows down. Yeah?
Did he do the same list? So he's recalling the same list every single time?
No. So he was doing different lists every time.
Oh.
So, yeah. So the problem with recalling the same list every time is that you refresh it every time that you do the recall, right? Yeah. So, no, these are different lists and a lot of different trials. So it's pretty reliable data, actually. And it turns out that if you do the same sort of thing with all sorts of different materials, you know, instead of nonsense syllables, if you do it with prose passages, with words, with pictures, things like that, that you get this forgetting curve. And everybody shows this same kind of forgetting curve. So what is this? This is a test from 1952 where they do essentially the same thing. And I forget what the stimuli were here. So forgetting appears to follow this log scale, sort of like decay, right? We know lots of things that decay on a log scale. So radioactive decay follows this log scale, right? So maybe what's going on is that forgetting is just decay. You encode the information initially, and then it decays over time. It just sort of evaporates. And if you look at other kinds of materials, if you put it on a log scale, so notice that this is log now, so it goes 10, 20, 1, 2, 4, 8, 12, etc., etc. So if you put it on a log scale, it just straightens out the line. And so these guys use, in 1930, they use poems, syllables, nonsense syllables. These are all words, nonsense syllables for Ebbinghaus from 1885. So they all follow this same sort of scale, indicating that all of your forgetting is just decay, right? It goes in there and then it just decays if you're not thinking about it. Well, this sort of raises a problem, right? So if it's just decay, is it like radioactive decay? Is it like rust? Is it like, you know, sort of these more chemical processes that happen in time? But the thing with chemical processes is it's not just time per se that causes the decay, right? So with rust, what's going on? Is it that iron, if you leave it alone for long enough, will just evaporate? What's happening with rust? Right, exactly. So there's a chemical process, oxidation, that happens in time. So it's not the time that matters. If you leave it in a dry environment, there's no, you know, or in a vacuum, nothing's going to happen. It's got to have the water present, right? It's got to be able to oxidize. So anybody know how to pronounce this name? I think it's McGeach. I like saying it McGeach, and so I'm going to say it McGeach. Anybody else? Anybody that... McGuff? McGaw? I don't know.
I'm going to say McGoich.
McGoich? That's even more fun. All right, so McGeach. 1932 says, the passage of time per se does not cause anything to happen. It's the process occurring in time. So the question now becomes, okay, so if memories are decaying in time, then there's got to be some process that's happening in time. What's that process? Is it oxidation? Are you oxidizing your neurons? No, probably not. How do you actually test this? So with iron, you can do two things. You can put it in a wet environment and watch the oxidation happen, or you can put it in a dry environment and no oxidation happens. Or you can put it in a vacuum and nothing's going to happen to it. So with memory, how do we test this? Put a person in a vacuum? Yeah, no, that's not going to look very pretty, is it? So what do? I mean, the ideal test would be have some encoding experience and then test immediately to see what performance is. Have encoding, then have a delay, and then test. And then during this delay, you control for what's going on. So you can see, is memory going to decay over time? Or is it going to be the same if we control for intervening things? So if we stop this process right here, then the memory at these 2 time points should be exactly the same, right? So ideally, if it's decay, then you should see bad memory at the second time point due to that decay. So what's going on in this decay period? So we are actually starting an experiment soonish in my lab where we're going to have people come in at 9 in the morning and learn a list of objects, actually. So we're going to show you a bunch of pictures of objects and then come back at 9 p.m. and then we're going to test your memory for these things. Or we're going to have you come in at 9 p.m., learn the list, come back the next morning at 9 a.m. So the question is, what's going on, what's going to be different between these 2 intervals, right? The 9 a.m. versus 9 p.m. Or in other words, the going about your normal daily activities versus getting a good night's sleep. So the question is, does sleep help your memory? So what actually happens, so this is our paradigm right here, actually. So what are you doing during your day? What's happening here? Maybe that's not happening here.
Maybe you're having to remember a ton of other sheets.
Okay, so you've got other memory processes going on here, right? So either remembering a ton of other things or maybe encoding a ton of other things. So the stuff that you learn in your 9 a.m. class, and then if you go to your 10 a.m. class and then all the other classes throughout the day, is there going to be any overlap between that stuff? Well, if you're in my sensation and perception class, yeah, it turns out that there's going to be a lot of overlap. Anybody who's in 370 with me? Michael, there are a couple of other people. Today's lecture is going to look very, very familiar to you. Just a heads up on that. We're going to talk about attention in that class today. We've already talked about attention in here. I see no reason to write 2 separate lectures for the same topic, so you're going to get the same lecture. It's been updated. It looks prettier, but it's the same stuff. All right, so yeah, so that's going to overlap, right? Or maybe it won't overlap. Maybe you'll have, other stuff. You'll learn about, I don't know, you'll learn a new vocabulary word, linsanity, for example. This is something that I picked up in the last week. So there's all sorts of, stuff that you're going to be learning. And, okay, is that going to impact your memory? Well, it turns out, yeah. So maybe while you're asleep, you're not encoding new information or you're not retrieving old information. You don't have any opportunity for this interference to happen. And maybe that's what's going on. So it turns out that if it were just decay, that in these 2 conditions, your memory should be exactly the same, right? So if all that's happening is some process happens over time, some maybe biopsychological process, just the biology happens in time, then, and this decay happens, then whether you're sleeping or whether you're going about your normal daily activities, we shouldn't see any difference. So this is an empirical test, right? So this is an empirical question. What do we see in our paradigm when we bring you in at 9 a.m. versus 9 p.m. and then test you 12 hours later? Would we expect to see any difference, or would we expect to see this normal Ebbinghaus forgetting curve? Well, this shows you how far the field has come. In 1924, Jenkins and Dallenbach did the same experiment that we're embarking on right now, where they had people come in the morning and then go about their normal daily activity and then tested 8 hours later, or they had them come in the evening, go to sleep for 8 hours, and then test it. And guess what they found? Is your memory better or worse after you have a good night's sleep? Better, yeah. So they found that. So it turns out that if you wake people up at various intervals, so this is number of hours, 2 hours, so 1 hour, 2 hour, 4 hour, 6 hour, 8 hours later, that the people who are sleeping, so you see a normal forgetting curve at first, but then the slope sort of bottoms out and becomes more shallow earlier on with sleep than with your normal daily activities. So there's got to be something going on with sleep here that's protecting your memory. So what are the candidate processes? So it turns out that what you do during the delay does matter. So it can't be just decay, because if you're sleeping, then you have better memory than if you're not. Kayla?
What do you mean by just decay? Because I thought you said that, like, you mean just time? Like, just
Yeah, so it's this idea that comes from McGeach, that so if it's just the passage of time, then it shouldn't matter what you're doing in the middle.
I'm confused because, like, you're saying it's not just decay, but I thought you said, like, if there's decay, then over time, decay is what makes a difference.
Yeah, so I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So
Okay.
so at the time that Jenkins and Dallenbach are doing their experiment, everybody says that, oh, it's just decay. Your memory just decays. Ebbinghaus showed us this, in 1885. And so they say, okay, well, we can test that, right? So if it's just decay, so rust, for example, does rust ever stop? No, it doesn't matter if you're asleep or not. Rust is still going to happen. So,
But could the sleep be like the oxygen and all? Like, be like the water? Like, could there be something in the sleep that is the decay? Does that make sense? Like,
yeah. So if the only process is decay, then it shouldn't matter if you're sleeping or not. But it turns out that it does matter if you're sleeping. So there's got to be something else that's going on here. So it can't be just decay. It might be decay because you'll notice that the sleepers forget as well. So there may be some decay going on there as well. But there's something on top of that accounts for this difference here. So what is that? What's going on in between that's different?
I'm just curious, have they ever tried, so after this sleeping period and waking period, does more decay happen when that person wakes up, or does it curve off for after that 8 hours?
Oh, yeah. So if we were to wait 24 hours, for example, and see, do they continue to forget? No. It turns out they don't. So there's some protective measure. So it's not just that sleep stops or pauses the decay and then it continues after that. It's that sleep consolidates the information. So you forget it pretty easily at first, but then you have this process called consolidation that happens. And sleep seems to help with consolidation. So this is really what our question is what does your memory look like after consolidation? So consolidation means just going from some malleable or labile state, something that you can change, to being fairly impervious, fairly permanent. So it turns out that with this information that you're learning, so lists of words, for example, at first it's going to depend on a structure called the hippocampus in the medial temporal lobe of the brain. And that over time, memories become hippocampus independent. And so that's called systems consolidation. You're going from being hippocampal dependent to being hippocampal independent, and sleep seems to be important for this process. So we've known about consolidation for a good long time. It goes all the way back to a 19th century French physician named Ribot, who was studying people who had brain damage. So these people would come in with essentially TBIs, traumatic brain injuries. And what he found was that the older the memory was, the more impervious it was to brain damage, the more solid it was, basically. So if you get a TBI, you're going to forget the most recent thing that happened. So I've got this great video clip of Tim Tebow getting sacked when he was at Florida State. Was he at Florida or Florida State? Florida. Okay. Oops. Shows you what I know about football. At any rate, so Tim Tebow, it's a quarterback, for those of you who are sort of at my level. Gets sacked, and as he's going down, there's somebody else standing behind him, so his head hits smack on this other guy's knee, and he is out. He goes rigid and then completely flaccid. So he's got a concussion, no doubt about it. Although he maintained that, no, I didn't go out, because if you get a concussion, then the rules say that you've got to sit out at least some amount of playtime, and he didn't want to do that. So you drag him off to the sidelines, and you can see on the video they've got an extreme close up on him as he's talking to the people around him, And he says two things when he sort of comes to. The first is, did I hang on to the ball? And the second is, what quarter is it? He had no idea what was going on. So this sort of thing happens all the time in traumatic brain injury, where you forget some amount of time, right? Some amount of what has just happened. And the more extensive the brain damage, the more you're going to forget, the farther back this retrograde amnesia is going to happen. So it turns out that we forget, we're actually not going to talk a whole lot about this, so we're going to talk about it now. We forget the more recent stuff. So it turns out that if you get a TBI, if you get amnesia, you don't tend to forget your name. Because when did you learn your name? How old were you when you learned your name? By age 2, probably. My 19-month-old daughter knows her name. She'll say it, and it's really cute and adorable and everything. So this is some information that you've had for a very, very, very long time. So if you get bonked on the head, you're more likely to forget, what you were just doing, what quarter it is in the football game, versus what your name is. So the whole depiction of amnesia in the movies, where you get bonked on the head and you forget who you are and what you do and stuff like that, where you grew up, doesn't really happen like that. And incidentally, if you get bonked on the head again, that information ain't coming back. You're just going to get more traumatic brain injuries with repeated injuries. All right, so Ribot's law is first in, last out, basically. The older the information is, the more impervious it is. Why? Because it's been consolidated. The stuff that hasn't been consolidated yet, what you were just doing, whether you hung onto the ball or not, etc., that information is going to go, but the information that's been consolidated is fairly impervious. So consolidation happens over time. So maybe what's going on with sleep is that it allows us to consolidate this information and make it less susceptible to interference. Maybe what's going on when you're not sleeping is that the information that's coming in for the rest of the day is interfering with the information that you already learned. We'll talk about interference in just a little bit. So why do we forget? So we've been talking about delay. Delay is probably not what's going on in forgetting. There are some other candidates for why do we forget that include occlusion, unlearning, and interference. I'm going to give you the punchline, and I've sort of already hinted at the punchline, that interference accounts for most forgetting. These other two may occur under certain circumstances, and I'll show you some examples of where these other two occur, but most of what's going on is interference. All right, so occlusion first up. So trying to remember your phone number. If you've moved or if you've changed cell phone providers or something like that, then you may have a new phone number that's different than your old phone number. And so maybe what's happening with remembering your old phone number. So can you remember your last phone number? Yes, no. If I really press you on it, do you think that you could do it? I can't do it. I cannot remember my landline number. And it hasn't been that long since I got rid of it. All right, so maybe what's going on is that you've got the information. The old number is in there somewhere, and if I say, "Can you remember it?" you might have this tip of the tongue phenomenon where you feel like, "Yeah, I know this. It had a 3 in it." And maybe what's going on is that the new number, the old information is still in there. It's just the new information gets in the way and occludes the old information. It just comes in front of the old information. So when I give you the prompt, the cue, what's your phone number, that one has a stronger connection to that cue. And the other one, the connection between the question, what's your phone number, and that old information, that connection just gets weaker and weaker. So you build up this connection, you weaken that connection. Most of the time, this probably isn't the case. So under the certain circumstances of your phone number and this one specific cue, maybe that might be what's going on. Probably not. So if you're forgetting what you had for dinner last Thursday night, there's not new information that's occluding the old information. You haven't retrieved that old information. There's new stuff that's come in that's supplanted it. All right, so that's occlusion. May occur in some circumstances, probably not account for a lot of forgetting. Unlearning. Oh, wait, this is what I just said, wasn't it? Yeah, so the difference between occlusion and unlearning, for me at least, is pretty hazy. This is going to sound a lot like what I just said for occlusion. So with unlearning, what happens is the associative bond between cue and response is weakened. It works for recall, but not necessarily for recognition. So if I show you your old phone number, are you going to recognize it any better than your new phone number? No, I don't know. I tend to not recognize my old phone number. Again, doesn't seem to account for much forgetting. So we're really not. So you can unlearn the unlearning idea. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some examples of interference. This accounts for a lot of what's going on with forgetting. So I'm going to show you two lists of words, and they're word pairs. So what you're going to see on this side is the words are arranged in pairs, and I want you to learn the pairs together. So to help with encoding, maybe imagine the two items interacting with one another. So if the word pairs are bath and vegetable, for example, imagine, I don't know, somebody come up with a way that bath and vegetable can interact. So a carrot taking a bath, something like that. Or you could imagine V8 juice in your bathtub or something like that. So yeah, gross. But you're never going to forget that one, right? Okay. So imagine something like that. So come up with a way for these pairs to interact. And I'll give you about a minute to encode this information. About 20 seconds. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, you got them all? All right, now I'm going to show you another list. I want you to do basically the same thing. So it's word pairs. Imagine the two words interacting with one another. Got 20 seconds left. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so what I want you to do is, this is the first word from the list. What I want you to do is write down the pairs from the first list. So the first one was bath and vegetable. So that's the list that I want you to write down. So these are the cue words I want you to come up with, the pairs to these cues. All right, you got them all? All that you're going to get? All right, so what have you got? Bath, vegetable, knight, shield, buckle, tide, stool, wind, dress, slit, gallery, slap. That's as far as I got. Yard, chestnut, mirror, string, waist, tack, seal, brass, smoke. Okay. Did anybody have any trouble with the second list? Did the second list ever intrude into your first list? Yeah, sort of.
I put the second list with the first list, so they were all three together in the same picture.
Oh, did you? Oh, that's clever. Okay. All right. So, any other strategies? No? Did you just try and come up with different pictures? So, bath, and what was the second one? Canoe. Gallery, hymn, yard, necklace. Okay. So this is what's known as an ABAC design. So the A is the stimulus term, so it's the first word in the pairs. And then the B or the C are the response terms. So the question is, does the C list interfere with the B list? So if you learn AB and then you learn AC, and then a while later, after a variable delay, I give you A, are you going to be able to come up with B, or does C get in the way? Or if I ask you for C, does B get in the way? Things like that. So this is a pretty robust paradigm, and for a good chunk of the 20th century, this was the learning paradigm in psychology. And it goes all the way back to, again, the 19th century, 1900s. And some of the very first experimental psychologists looking at this question of forgetting. So it turns out that the timing matters between the presentation of the AB, AC, and then the test, and then the similarity between AB and AC matters. So, for example, Müller and Pilzecker in 1900 published this monograph where they had people study list A, and then after a 17-second delay, study list X, as they called it, and then they tested for list A. And so these are word pairs. Then they did a different delay where they did study list A, then a 6-minute delay, study list X, and then an immediate test. And it turns out that the longer the delay, the easier it was, because you have more of a temporal separation. So if I ask you, tell me what we talked about yesterday versus tell me what we talked about a week ago yesterday, it's easier to remember the stuff and keep separate the stuff that we talked about yesterday versus a long time ago. But if I give you, so the AB and the AC lists today, and then I wait a week and I give you A, and I say, tell me the AB terms, what do you think is going to happen? Yeah, you're going to switch them around. Why?
Because you can't remember which list was going to which.
Right, exactly. So where we did it, the AB, AC, and then an immediate test, well, that's easy, because the one was 2 minutes ago, the one was 1 minute ago. That's pretty simple to keep straight. But if I waited a week, or even if I waited 24 hours, one was I studied 24 hours and 1 minute ago, one was studied exactly 24 hours ago. So that 1 minute now doesn't make that big of a difference. And so it's easier to confuse the two, right? You don't have that big of a temporal shift between them. So timing matters. So if you have time to consolidate some information, it turns out that it's much more resistant to interference. Specifically to, I think this was the title of one of these slides, to retroactive interference. So retroactive interference means that, we'll abbreviate it RI. This is where new information interferes with old information. So it goes back in time. So your new phone number interferes with your old phone number. Proactive interference is the opposite. Proactive interference is where the old information interferes with the new information. So the old stuff that you know gets in the way of encoding new information. Retroactive interference goes back in time. And this seems to be a huge part of what's going on. So you learn a list of words in the morning, and then you go about your daily activity. You have other mental events that are happening. All of that stuff has retroactive interference for the stuff that you learned in the morning. So when you come to test 12 hours later, you're going to forget it. So retroactive interference is a huge part of what's going on with this Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. You get a lot of interference at first, but that information that's staying on is getting consolidated. And so the more it's able to be consolidated, the more impervious it is to retroactive interference, and so the more likely you are to remember it. So information that's still undergoing consolidation is labile. You can mess with it. You can interfere with it. Information that's already consolidated is resistant to interference, and it's not gonna. You're not going to mess around with it. So this is not really a question that I get a lot at BYU, but where I've taught at other institutions, particularly San Diego State, which is kind of a party school. I did get this question. So is it true that if you learn something while under the influence of alcohol, you'll be able to remember it better if you are under the influence again? So what does this sound like? Something we talked about last week. Yeah, the context memory. So contextually dependent memory, and does context help? So remember the scuba divers, they remembered better in the same condition as they learned. So the question was about alcohol. Is it true that if you are drunk when you remember something, or drunk when you learn something, that you're better able to remember it if you're in the same intoxicated state? Turns out, no, that's not the case. Turns out that alcohol disrupts consolidation. So if you learn some information while drunk, you're not going to remember it. This is what the alcoholic blackout is alcohol interfering with consolidation. But it turns out that alcohol does improve your memory for the stuff you learned immediately before the alcohol consumption. So thinking about interference, why would that be the case? Elizabeth?
Because when you're wasted, you're not aware of anything.
Right. So you're not encoding new information. Right, exactly. So there's not anything new coming in. So the old stuff has plenty of time to get consolidated. So it's something like this. So usually what happens is that you learn some information, you have new information that comes in and interferes with the old information. Because this stuff hasn't been consolidated yet, you're trying to consolidate this stuff. Consolidation is a sort of a limited process, sort of like attention, and you can't consolidate everything. So there's sort of a competition. But if you take out the new information and you just allow the old information to be consolidated, well, then your memory actually improves for that old information.
So the kind of like blackout periods when people are drunk are similar to sleep?
Yeah, so that's the idea. That during sleep, so you've all probably heard, as a study tip, study the information that you really want to learn right before you go to sleep. And then what happens is during sleep, you get a little bit of both. You get a little bit of no new information is coming in, plus sleep seems to enhance consolidation. So it's not just an absence of new information. It's also sleep does something above and beyond that. But alcohol is similar to that in that alcohol prevents any new information from coming in. So this is a quote from sorry, it's so small, from a paper by John Wickstead, where he says, whereas alcohol consumption induces a certain degree of anterograde amnesia, i.e. the alcoholic blackout, for material studied under the influence of the drug, many studies have reported that it actually results in improved memory for material studied just prior to consumption. So this is a useless study aid, particularly if you're going to follow the honor code, the word of wisdom. But it turns out that it's true. Also, not all information interferes equally. So if you've got two lists of words, word lists interfere pretty badly. So if we have bath, vegetable, and then we have bath and canoe, you get some interference there. If we had bath and fruit, that would be even worse interference, so things that are very similar. But if we then, so if this was our AB list, and then our AC list was something like this, words paired with pictures, it turns out you don't get any interference for this sort of stuff. So if we completely change the stimulus type, that interference goes way down. Interference depends to a great extent on the similarity between the stimuli. So much so, I don't know if this is even worth talking about, so much so that you get sort of this continuum, this U-shaped function. So the more similar the stimulus is, the more interference you get until it gets close enough to be almost exactly the same, and then that actually boosts your memory if you're studying the same stuff over again. So this is known as Skaggs-Robinson Law. It's never been actually experimentally demonstrated, so we're going to skip it. Because I want to talk a little bit more about this difference between proactive and retroactive interference. So retroactive interference is where the new information coming in interferes with the old information. Proactive is the opposite, where you study a list of words, and we've actually had a demonstration of proactive interference in here within working memory. So do you guys remember the fruits? So where I had you remember lists of fruits, and then there was a second list that was all fruits, and a third list that was all fruits, and after a while, you get all this interference building up. So your performance on the third list was much worse than your performance on the first list. Is this ringing any bells? Yeah, you're a lively bunch today. But then we study, I gave you a list of professions, and you get this release from proactive interference. So we've seen examples of this before. And then this comes back full circle around to what we talked about earlier. So another theory is that you don't forget anything, that it's all in there, and that we just need better cues to get at this information. This is not a very scientific theory because it's impossible to generate testable hypotheses from it. So the answer is always, well, if subjects aren't performing on it, then what do you need to do? Get a better test. Right, get a more sensitive test. Okay, well, that's always going to be your answer. All right, so in summary, we talked about sensory memory, which has relatively large capacity and immediate decay. Actually, no, we didn't talk about any of this stuff. So this is summary from the last time. So this is summary from today. Long-term memory does not appear to be infinite. You can't remember absolutely everything. So you do forget things, and you appear to forget things on this log scale, where you forget a lot at first as you're trying to consolidate things, and some stuff gets consolidated, some stuff doesn't. The stuff that does get consolidated sticks around, and you're going to maintain that information even if you lose your hippocampus, for example. So you don't know where you put your hippocampus, you lose it. No, sorry. You have brain damage, you're going to lose this ability. Yeah, so that's forgetting happens along a curve. Any questions from today? All right, I will see you tomorrow. Hooray. No, so quiz is going to be Friday. So it seems kind of pointless to have a quiz today and then another quiz 3 days later. So quiz will be on Friday. It'll be on memory stuff. I forgot which chapter.